Linda Lee Clapp married into the Trump family in January of 1962, a 22-year-old flight attendant from Kalamazoo, Michigan, marrying the oldest son of a real estate empire she barely understood the size of. 9 years later, she was gone, having thrown her husband out of their own home and filed for divorce because of his drinking. 11 years after that, he was dead at 42, alone in a Queens hospital while the rest of his family, by his own daughter's later account, stayed home or went to the movies. And nearly 2 decades after his death, the family patriarch's will would strip Linda's own children out of the inheritance entirely, a fight that ended, almost unbelievably, with someone's medical insurance getting cut off while a baby lay in intensive care with a seizure disorder. Subscribe if you're into this kind of thing, and stick around, because it gets worse. Fred Trump Sr. had built a real estate fortune worth, by his grandson Fred III's own later estimate, at least a couple $100 million by the time Linda entered the family, constructing and managing apartment complexes across Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island starting in the years after World War II. His own father, Frederick Trump, had arrived in the United States from Germany as a teenager in 1885, eventually building a modest hospitality and real estate business of his own before dying young, in the 1918 flu pandemic, leaving a teenage Fred Sr. to take over what little remained and rebuild it into something considerably larger. That family template, a father who died leaving an unfinished empire, and a son who spent his life proving he could finish it and then some, seems to have hardened into the exact model Fred Sr. later applied to his own children, expecting toughness and business instinct as the price of belonging in the family at all. Fred III, writing decades later in his own memoir, described his grandfather as an old-style patriarch who presided over a large, rambunctious family and managed deliberately to dominate its members and sometimes pit them against one another. He described his Aunt Mary Ann, the oldest of the 5 siblings and later a federal judge, as whip-smart but often cruel within the family even as she built an impressive public career outside it. That was the household Linda married into at 22, a family that ran on competition and toughness as organizing principles, one where a woman who'd grown up steady and grounded in a small Michigan town was walking into Sunday dinners at a Queens colonial mansion that Fred III himself later described as consistently tense. Linda Lee Clapp was born November 7, 1939, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the daughter of Gerald Robert Clapp and Mary Louise Rolfe, and she grew up in Kalamazoo Township before eventually taking a job as an airline flight attendant, a career that put her in the air constantly and, by most accounts, gave her a level of independence unusual for a young woman from a small Midwestern family in the late 1950s. She first crossed paths with Frederick Crace Trump Jr. around 1958, reportedly while both were vacationing separately in the Bahamas, though nothing serious came of it right away. The relationship actually took off in 1961, when Linda called Fred, whom she'd stayed loosely in touch with, to ask if he knew of any apartments near Idlewild Airport in Queens, the airport now called JFK, since her flight schedule required her to live close by. He did know of apartments. His family, after all, owned a considerable number of them across Queens and Brooklyn. The two started dating properly from there, and Fred proposed in 1961. They married in January of 1962 in Broward County, Florida, and Linda resigned from her airline job immediately afterward, since the airline didn't allow married women to keep working as flight attendants, a standard policy of the era that ended her own career the moment she said yes to his. They settled into Manhattan, and their first child, Fred Trump III, was born that November. The following year, they moved into one of Fred Trump Sr.'s own apartment buildings in Jamaica, Queens, arrangement that put Linda under her father-in-law's literal roof rent-free, which sounds generous until you understand what else came bundled with it. To understand what Linda actually married into, you have to understand what Fred Jr. had already spent his whole life fighting against. As the oldest son of Fred Trump Sr., he was expected from childhood to inherit and run the family real estate business, but what he actually loved, obsessively and from a young age according to his own frat brothers at Lehigh University, was aviation. After graduating in 1960, he pursued flight training and eventually got hired by TWA, flying as a secondary pilot starting around 1964, living out the one thing he'd wanted since he was a kid. His father wasn't impressed. According to a Lehigh fraternity brother named David Miller, who later became Fred Jr.'s own lawyer, Fred Trump Sr. dismissed the entire profession as nothing more than being a chauffeur in the sky, a phrase that apparently got repeated inside the family often enough that it stuck. Donald, 7 years younger and already being groomed as the more obedient alternative, reportedly told his brother directly, "Come on, Freddie, what are you doing? You're wasting your time." That pressure didn't let up once Linda entered the picture. If anything, having a wife and, soon, children gave the family more leverage, more reasons Fred Jr. supposedly needed to abandon flying and settle into something stable and family-approved. Fred Jr. lasted only a matter of months as an actual line pilot before the mounting pressure from home, combined according to former TWA colleagues with drinking that had already started creeping upward, ended his flying career. He came back to Queens and started doing maintenance work on his father's properties instead, a demotion from captain's wings to fixing radiators that friends who knew him at the time described as visibly humiliating for a man who'd wanted exactly one thing his entire life and had it taken away twice, once by his father's disapproval and once by the drinking that disapproval had helped feed. Fred Trump III later wrote about one particular episode from this period that captures the family dynamic better than almost anything else on record. Not long after Fred Jr. left the family company to enter TWA's pilot training program in Kansas City, and later during additional training in Massachusetts, his drinking had already started escalating, according to Fred III's own account, from beer to hard liquor, mostly scotch. Fred Trump Sr. dispatched Donald and Robert, the two younger brothers, up to Massachusetts specifically to retrieve Fred Jr. and bring him back to New York. "This is ridiculous," Donald reportedly told him there. "You're wasting your time," then passed along their father's own assessment of the entire profession, that airline pilots were nothing more than flying bus drivers. It's essentially the same put-down that reached David Miller through a different channel and got remembered as the chauffeur in the skyline, told twice, by two different sources, which suggests it wasn't a one-time comment so much as something Fred Sr. said often enough that it became the family's settled verdict on his oldest son's entire life ambition. The same years that were quietly destroying Fred Jr. were the years that built Donald Trump's public career. Donald joined the family company in 1971, the same general period his older brother had already been pushed out of flying and back into maintenance work, and within a decade, Donald had rebranded the business as the Trump Organization, negotiated the tax abatement that got the Grand Hyatt built in 1980, and broken ground on Trump Tower, the building that would turn his name into a New York City landmark by the time it opened in 1983. He married his first wife, Ivana, in 1977 and became a fixture at Studio 54 and other corners of Manhattan nightlife. The same tabloids that had once had no interest in Fred Jr. at all were now covering obsessively. Linda's former husband, meanwhile, spent that same decade gaunt, increasingly unwell, and living back under his parents' roof, watching the younger brother he'd once been measured against inherit the exact position their father had always wanted for him instead. Mary Trump, writing decades later as both his daughter and a clinical psychologist, has argued that Fred Sr.'s decision to reward Donald's ruthlessness while punishing Fred Jr.'s sensitivity wasn't incidental to how the family turned out. It was the entire mechanism. One brother built up specifically because the other one had already been used as the cautionary example of what happened if you wanted something softer, like flying planes or, for that matter, a functional marriage. Between the 1970 divorce and his death in 1981, Fred Jr.'s life outside the marriage didn't improve. According to New York Times reporting drawn on by multiple later accounts, he cycled through modest jobs connected to the family company, his drinking continued rather than stabilized, and he eventually moved back into his parents' house in Jamaica Estates, the same Tudor colonial where he and Donald had grown up, now returning to it in his late 30s as a man whose marriage, career, and health had all collapsed roughly in parallel. Fred Jr.'s childhood friend and fellow pilot William Drake stayed close to him through some of this period, and other former classmates who visited described someone who bore little resemblance to the fun-loving campus jokester his old fraternity brothers remembered from Lehigh. Linda, for her part, was raising Fred III and Mary largely on her own during these same years, keeping them mostly separate from the worst of what their father was going through, though not entirely insulated from the family gatherings that periodically forced everyone back into the same room. Linda watched all of this happen from the inside of a marriage that was barely a year or two old by the time it started. She and Fred Jr. had their second child, a daughter named Mary, born May 3, 1965, and by then the pattern in the household was already forming. A husband increasingly checked out through alcohol, a father-in-law who treated Linda's own home as an extension of his real estate portfolio, and a family culture that, according to both of Linda's children's later published accounts, prized dominance and competitiveness over almost anything resembling warmth. Fred Jr. reportedly told a psychiatrist at one point, plainly, that he didn't want to stop drinking. The psychiatrist told him he couldn't help someone who didn't want help. That exchange, recounted years later by Miller, gives a fairly stark sense of where things stood inside a marriage most of Queens and Manhattan had no idea was falling apart, since the Trumps, even then, were skilled at projecting a version of family life considerably tidier than what was actually happening behind it. If any part of this, watching someone you love disappear into something they won't fight, or living inside a family that rewards toughness over honesty, feels like it's touching something familiar in your own life, that's worth sitting with for a second. Feel free to share your own experience with something like that down in the comments, because stories like Linda's tend to resonate with more people than you'd expect. One incident from these years surfaced only decades later, in Mary Trump's 2020 memoir, and it's about as stark a picture of the marriage as exists on the record. Mary wrote that when she was around 2 years old, so roughly 1967, she heard her mother screaming and found her father, apparently drunk, laughing while pointing a rifle at Linda's face. It was a gun Fred Jr. kept aboard the family's boat, reportedly for shooting at sharks in the water, though the book never fully explains why it ended up aimed at his wife instead. Mary Trump doesn't frame the moment as an isolated act of violence so much as a symptom of exactly how far the drinking had progressed by the mid to late 1960s, turning a man friends remembered as the fun-loving, joke-cracking opposite of his younger brother Donald into someone capable of terrifying his own wife in front of a toddler. It's one of the very few concrete scenes involving Linda that made it into either of her children's books at all, which itself says something about how thoroughly she was written out of her own family's later retellings of this period. By the late 1960s, Linda was effectively running the household by herself. Fred Jr.'s drinking had progressed to the point where TWA colleagues noticed it affecting his reliability even during his brief window flying, and after he returned to working under his father in Queens, the drinking, according to multiple accounts collected later by journalists and by Mary Trump herself, only accelerated. Linda was raising 2 young children, Fred III still a toddler, and Mary an infant, inside a family that, according to Fred Trump III's own later memoir, valued financial toughness over almost anything else, and had little patience or vocabulary for a daughter-in-law's struggles with an alcoholic husband. Fred Trump Sr., according to reporting later published by the New York Times, came to blame Linda specifically for Fred Jr.'s drinking, a framing that put the burden for her husband's addiction back onto the wife trying hardest to hold the family together while it happened. By 1970, according to accounts collected by Fred Jr.'s own friend and later lawyer David Miller, Linda decided she was finished. She threw Fred Jr. out of their home and filed for divorce shortly afterward, ending a marriage that had lasted 8 years, most of them consumed by a husband's escalating alcoholism and a father-in-law's ongoing disapproval of practically everything Fred Jr. had ever wanted for himself. The divorce was finalized in 1970, and Linda kept custody of Fred III, then 7, and Mary, then 5. What the divorce didn't do was cut Linda loose from the family entirely, and what happened next is one of the stranger, less discussed details of the whole story. Even after the marriage legally ended, Linda continued being required to show up at Trump family holiday gatherings, an arrangement Mary Trump described in her own memoir without ever fully explaining why it continued or who insisted on it. Mary wrote about finding her own mother at one of these parties sitting almost in the dark, alone at a table, her face described as stricken, present in the room but clearly unwanted by a family that had never particularly warmed to her in the first place, and now had even less reason to. Fred Trump III, describing the same category of gathering from his own side of the family decades later, called them tense holiday dinners at his grandparents' colonial mansion in Queens, presided over by a patriarch he said managed his large family by keeping its members somewhat pitted against one another, which suggests Linda wasn't imagining the coldness so much as walking directly into a dynamic that operated that way for everyone in the room, family member or not. It's a detail that critics of Mary Trump's book have pointed out gets remarkably little space considering how central Linda actually was to the family's history. One reviewer for Current Affairs noting that Mary's own memoir never discloses what became of her mother's life afterward, never explains what those years alone were actually like for her, and doesn't even mention, anywhere in the book, that Linda had died by the time it was published. The woman who arguably absorbed the worst of this family's dysfunction firsthand ends up as close to a footnote in her own daughter's telling of it. Fred Jr.'s health deteriorated steadily through the 1970s. He gave up flying entirely, worked modest jobs within the family company, and by the New York Times later reporting, moved back into his parents' house in Queens as his condition worsened, a fully grown man in his late 30s returning to live under the roof of the father whose disapproval had arguably done as much to break him as the alcohol itself. Friends and former classmates who visited him during this period described someone gaunt and visibly unwell. According to Mary Trump's memoir, in the weeks before his death, the Trump family, despite owning financial stakes in multiple hospitals and having every resource available to secure him serious medical care, made no such call. She wrote plainly that a single phone call would have guaranteed her father the best treatment available, and that nobody in the family made it. A high school classmate named Nolan, who'd known Fred Jr. since before any of this started, visited him during the final years and later described someone gaunt, ill, and hospitalized on multiple occasions before the last one finally took him. By the late 1970s, according to that same account, Donald Trump's life was being covered in the press like a celebrity's. Studio 54 appearances, and a new marriage and buildings rising across Manhattan with his name on them, while his older brother was, in Nolan's telling, wasting away in the same general neighborhood the two of them had grown up in together. It's the kind of contrast that's easy to state flatly and harder to actually sit with. One brother's decline running on a near-exact parallel track with the other's ascent, both of them shaped by the same father, both of them measured against a version of success only one of them had ever been permitted to want. On September 26, 1981, Fred Trump Jr. died of a heart attack brought on by years of alcohol abuse. He was 42 years old. According to Mary Trump's account, he went to the hospital that night alone, without any family member accompanying him. And while he lay dying, Donald Trump and his sister Elizabeth were at a movie theater. Mary Trump has said publicly, including in a televised interview, that she doesn't actually know which film they saw that night, only that her father died without anyone from his own family in the room. Donald Trump later described his brother's death as having a profound impact on his life, and told People magazine in 2015 that Fred Jr. was a fantastic guy who got stuck on alcohol. In a 2019 interview with the Washington Post, Trump went further, saying he regretted the pressure both he and their father had put on Fred Jr. to abandon flying, calling it a mistake to assume everyone would want the same thing out of life. Whether that regret changes anything about what happened in that hospital room in September of 1981 is a question the record simply doesn't answer either way. Fred Trump Jr. was buried privately at All Faiths Cemetery in Queens, a modest, low-key send-off for a man whose own father had built an empire out of exactly the kind of visible, dominating presence Fred Jr. never had. His two children, Fred III, not yet 19, and Mary, just 16, lost their father the same year most of their peers were dealing with far more ordinary teenage concerns. Linda, divorced from him for over a decade by that point, attended as the mother of his children rather than as a widow, one more example of a woman positioned at the edge of a family event that was technically, legally, no longer entirely hers to grieve inside. Fred Trump Sr. died in 1999 after years of declining health that included, according to family accounts and later legal filings, a diagnosis of dementia. Linda's two children, Fred III and Mary, expected to inherit their father Fred Jr.'s share of the family estate the way any grandchild in his position normally would, stepping into what's known in estate law as their deceased parents' share by representation. Instead, they discovered their grandfather's will had been altered to cut them out almost entirely, a change that, according to Mary Trump's memoir and later New York Times reporting, was pushed through while Fred Trump Sr.'s cognitive decline had already left him vulnerable to influence from his three surviving children, Donald, Robert, and Mary Ann. Fred III and Mary sued in March of 2000, alleging their relatives had manipulated an ailing, disoriented man into revising a will, specifically to shut them out of an estate Fred III later estimated, based on court filings from the period, at somewhere between $250 and $300 million. The response to that lawsuit is the part of this story that tends to shock people who only know the broad outline. According to both Mary Trump's and Fred Trump III's separate memoirs, the family's answer to being sued was to cut off the medical insurance coverage Fred Trump Sr. had previously extended to the entire extended family, insurance that Fred III and his wife Lisa desperately needed at that exact moment, because their infant son had just been born with a severe, life-threatening neurological condition. William Trump, Fred III's third child, was born June 30, 1999, just days after Fred Trump Sr. died on June 25th, and, according to later reporting on the family's own legal filings, mere hours after his great-grandfather's funeral. Within weeks, he began experiencing infantile spasms, initially diagnosed as cerebral palsy and a seizure disorder, though doctors wouldn't identify the actual underlying cause, a rare genetic mutation called KCNQ2, until 15 years later. He needed extensive, ongoing medical care from infancy, including months in a neonatal intensive care unit, and Fred III has since written and spoken publicly, including in his 2024 memoir All in the Family, about receiving word that the family's medical coverage was being pulled during the exact stretch when his newborn son was fighting for his life. Fred III described it as the cruelest, most heartless thing his own relatives could have done to him, his wife, and his children, adding that he believed the timing was the entire point of doing it, a characterization a White House spokesperson later publicly disputed, denying any fraud had been committed against the family. Fred III has also alleged, in later interviews and in the memoir itself, that Donald Trump once told him directly, regarding William, that the boy doesn't recognize you, let him die, and move down to Florida. And separately, in a meeting about disability policy years later, that people in situations like William's should just die because of the cost involved. Trump's team has publicly disputed characterizations like these from both memoirs, calling various claims exaggerated or false, and it's worth noting neither Mary Trump's nor Fred Trump III's account has been independently verified in a courtroom, since the 2000 lawsuit itself ended in a confidential settlement in 2001 rather than a public trial. What is documented and undisputed is that the lawsuit happened, that the medical coverage was in fact cut during it, and that William Trump, now an adult living in a group home, has spent his entire life with a severe developmental disability that traces back to a condition discovered in the exact window his family was fighting over money instead of insurance forms. That 2001 settlement came with a non-disclosure agreement attached, one that would resurface nearly 2 decades later in a much bigger fight. In June of 2020, just weeks before Mary Trump's memoir was set to publish, Robert Trump, the youngest of the 5 siblings, sued to block the book entirely, arguing in court filings that the 2001 confidentiality agreement barred Mary from publishing any account concerning the will dispute or the family's relationships without everyone's consent. A New York trial judge briefly granted a temporary restraining order, and for a short window that summer it looked like the book might not come out on schedule at all. The restraint didn't last. An appellate judge lifted it, a Queens probate court ruled it didn't even have jurisdiction to decide the question, and by mid-July the case had been dismissed outright, clearing the way for publication. Donald Trump told reporters at the time that his niece was simply not allowed to write a book, and years later, in 2023, he separately sued Mary Trump and the New York Times directly, alleging she had violated that same 2001 agreement by providing the paper with confidential financial documents used in a major 2018 investigation into the Trump family's wealth and tax history. A judge overseeing that case noted the original settlement never specified an end date and that the family relationships it covered had, if anything, become more relevant to the public in 2020 than they'd been when the agreement was signed in 2001. 20 years after Linda's own children first sued over their father's inheritance, the paperwork from that fight was still, quite literally, showing up in court. Mary Trump was 16 when her father died, and she went on to earn a doctorate in clinical psychology from Adelphi University, a career path she has said directly connected to trying to understand what had actually happened inside her own family. She kept largely quiet about the details for decades, bound in part by the 2001 confidentiality agreement, until 2020, when she decided the public stakes of her uncle holding the presidency outweighed whatever legal risk came with breaking her silence. Too Much and Never Enough, published that July, framed her father's decline not as a private family tragedy, but as a case study in what happens when a household rewards cruelty and punishes vulnerability, with Fred Jr. cast as the son who broke under that system, and Donald as the one who learned to embody it instead. Critics of the book, including at least one reviewer who examined it closely, have pointed out that Linda herself gets remarkably little space in her own daughter's account, treated more as a supporting detail in Fred Jr.'s story than as someone whose own experience surviving that marriage might have been worth reconstructing in full. Fred Trump III followed his father to Lehigh University and built an independent career in commercial real estate, deliberately staying outside the Trump organization his uncle ran. He married Lisa Beth Laurent in 1989, and by the time William was born a decade later, Fred III had already spent years navigating a family that, by his own account, offered conditional warmth at best. William's diagnosis reshaped the rest of Fred III's life, pushing him toward disability advocacy that eventually included White House meetings during his uncle's presidency and, in 2024, the founding of a nonprofit called William's Journey, aimed at supporting families raising children with severe disabilities. That same year, he published All in the Family, a memoir that covered much of the same ground as his sister's book, while adding fresh detail, including the specific claims about his uncle's comments regarding William's care. William, now in his mid-20s, lives in a group home, and Fred III has continued speaking publicly about both his son's condition and the medical fund fight that once threatened to cut off his care entirely, treating the advocacy as unfinished business rather than a closed chapter. Linda Clapp. Trump lived another 2 decades past her divorce, largely out of the public eye, and mostly absent from either of her children's later retellings of the family she'd married into and eventually escaped. Records place her still living in Little Neck, New York, close to where she'd raised her children, in her final years, and she died February 25, 2001, at 61, though she was ultimately buried across the country in Yuba County, California. That same year, her children finally settled their lawsuit against the rest of the Trump family, a coincidence neither book dwells on. Friends and family who remembered her, according to some of the sparse public tributes that exist, described the same grounded, practical warmth she carried out of Kalamazoo as a young woman, a personality that apparently survived 9 years married into one of New York's more combustible families, and roughly 3 more decades watching that family's dysfunction ripple down into her own grandson's life. She isn't the villain of this story, and she isn't quite the hero either, mostly because neither of the 2 books written by the people who knew her best actually gave her enough space on the page to be either one. She's the person who saw the worst of it happening first, tried to get her kids out of it, and then spent the rest of her life mostly written out of the version everyone else kept telling. One final piece of this record surfaced almost by accident. While reporting on Too Much and Never Enough in August of 2020, the New York Times published excerpts of audio recordings Mary Trump had secretly made of conversations with her aunt, Mary Ann Trump Barry, the retired federal judge, over the preceding years. On the tapes, Mary Ann described her brother Donald in blunt terms, calling him cruel, and, in one recorded remark, complaining about what she called the phoniness of it all, seemingly referring to the gap between the family's public image and its private conduct, the exact gap this whole story keeps circling back to. Jack O'Donnell, a former executive at one of Donald Trump's Atlantic City casinos who went on to run an addiction treatment center in Arizona, told reporters around the same time that he believed the president still hadn't come to terms with his older brother's life or his death, a fairly striking assessment from someone who'd worked closely with Trump professionally and watched the Fred Jr. story linger in the background of the family for decades without ever really being resolved. The title Mary Trump chose for her memoir wasn't decorative. Too Much and Never Enough was, by her own explanation in interviews around the book's release, a direct reference to how her grandfather treated his 2 oldest sons differently. Fred Jr. was given too much pressure to become someone he wasn't, pushed relentlessly toward a business he never wanted while the one thing he actually loved got mocked out of him. And Donald was given never enough real accountability, rewarded instead for the ruthlessness that made him usable as the family's new face. Linda's marriage sat directly inside that formula without ever being named as part of it in the title itself. She married a man who'd already been assigned the role of disappointment before she ever met him, watched that role harden into addiction over the better part of a decade, and then spent the rest of her life inside a family that, by multiple accounts including her own sons, never really stopped treating both categories, too much and never enough, as the only 2 available settings for anyone unlucky enough to be born or married into it. The short version of this story that circulates online usually starts and ends with Fred Trump Jr.'s drinking, treating it as a private tragedy that happened to one unlucky son inside an otherwise successful family. The fuller version, the one built from 2 separate insider memoirs and years of subsequent reporting, looks considerably worse than that. It's a story about a young woman who married into a family that blamed her for her own husband's addiction rather than helping either of them, who kept getting summoned to family gatherings by people who clearly didn't want her there, whose husband died alone while the rest of his family went about an ordinary Saturday night, and whose grandson ended up caught in a fight over inheritance money that led directly to a disabled baby losing medical coverage in the middle of a genuine medical crisis. None of it required tabloid exaggeration to be disturbing. The actual documented record told by the people who lived inside it already gets there on its own.